All right, so let's get started. I've introduced myself, and now I'd like to give Dr. Ingrid Rodi and Emily Pereira a chance to tell us a little bit about themselves. So, Ingrid, why don't you start?
It's good to be here. Thanks for joining us. I'm a reproductive endocrinologist at UCLA, and I'm Director of Fertility Services in Santa Monica. I've been in practice for 30 years. So I've seen the entire evolution of this sort of assisted reproduction part of fertility, and I'm very excited to talk to you about fertility preservation and egg freezing today and answer your questions.
Thanks. Emily?
I'm Emily. Let's try this again. I'm Emily Pereira, and I'm a writer and a spiritual advocate, and I'm very passionate about helping people discover their innate creativity. I am honored to be here talking to you today. I just recently froze my eggs 2 weeks ago, so share that perspective with you.
A very fresh perspective.
Very fresh perspective.
And I'm so grateful to you both for being here. So I'd like to start with you, Dr. Ingrid Rodi, and ask you a few questions about the medical side of egg freezing. So could you start by just describing medically what happens during egg freezing and what a patient goes through in that process?
Okay, so the process is labor intensive. So if we were to freeze one egg at a time, it would be a very costly, even more costly than it is, and drawn out process. So what we do is we stimulate the ovaries to make more than the one egg that the ovary would normally make. There's usually a competition. A number of eggs present themselves for maturing, and then one or two win out. And part of it is because there's only so much hormone to stimulate the eggs to maturity. So we give the hormones by injection. Everybody would like this to be oral, but at this point it's still by injection. Mm-hmm. And for about 10 days. And we monitor the evolution or the maturation of the eggs with ultrasound and hormone tests so that we can pick the exact day to give a trigger shot. So the injections are daily for about 10 days. The minimum is usually about 9, the maximum about 12. And then when the follicles, which is the fluid around the egg, which we can see on ultrasound, get to about 1 inch in diameter, we give the trigger shot, and then we schedule the egg retrieval. And the egg retrieval is done typically under anesthesia, and it's done transvaginally. So the ultrasound that we use to monitor the eggs, we use also to retrieve them. And we attach a needle to the ultrasound, and under direct ultrasound guidance, we suction out the fluid from the ovaries and hand it off to the embryologist. The embryologist then identifies the eggs and freezes the eggs. In the case where there is a partner and we're freezing embryos, the eggs are fertilized and then the embryos are frozen at that point.
Thank you. That was a really great description. So now I went through the egg freezing process myself when I was 37, which is 4 years ago now. And at that time, 50% of the eggs would be destroyed in the unfreezing process. Mm-hmm. So, I was kind of told, like, I got around 20 eggs, and they said, okay, well, that should be enough for 1 round, maybe 2 rounds of IVF, 1 to 2 kids if you're lucky. But, we were anticipating this huge attrition of dropping off 50% when we unfreeze, and then more, each step of the way. So could you tell us a little bit about the numbers and the statistics in this day and age for unfreezing and what you could expect as a result of actual viable embryos?
Well, there are a couple parameters. The number one predictor of success is the woman's age and her ovarian reserve. So most of the information that we have, because it's a relatively young procedure, is in women under 35. But of course, if a woman who is 38 comes to us and says, I'm really years away from having my own baby, I would like to freeze eggs or embryos, it's still better to freeze them then than to wait 3 or 4 years for fertility. The other problem with knowing exactly what the success rates are is that most people freeze eggs not to use next month, but to use in several years,
Yeah.
or not at all if they're lucky and they get pregnant spontaneously. So that most of the eggs that have been frozen for fertility preservation are still frozen. And so we have very spotty evidence of what the thaw rate's going to be. So for women under 35 with good ovarian reserve, with vitrification, we may have, you may be able to get a pregnancy from 3 eggs. But many of the women freezing are not under 35 or don't have good ovarian reserve. So it's a little bit of a distribution. And we hope for 12 eggs when we're storing, banking eggs. But of course, if somebody has cancer and we can only get 6 eggs from them, that's still better to freeze the 6 than to not to freeze at all. So I think that the word is not completely in on what the exact thaw rate is going to be. Okay. Not only the thaw rate, but then you have to take the eggs through fertilization. They have to thaw, they have to be fertilized, and then they have to grow out before we put them in. So there's a lot of information that needs to be generated. We have much more information about frozen embryos.
How long has egg freezing been done?
Well, it's been done for many years. It's been done on a more commonly, for example, for cancer patients in the last 5 years. And then last year, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine took egg freezing off the. It's an experiment or a technique that's only should be used under experimental protocol. So now it is widely available. But of those eggs that have been frozen in that time frame, the vast majority is still frozen.
Right. So there aren't a lot of statistics on how many of those turn into healthy kids, right? Because it hasn't been done that much.
Yeah, we expect that the kids will be healthy. We just don't know what the thaw rate and all the way to baby percentage is. The percentage.
Can you tell us, you've mentioned, that a candidate, it's better if they're under 35, if she's under 35, if she has healthy ovarian reserves. Can you tell us just briefly how you would identify a good candidate for egg freezing?
So, any woman who's going to be facing chemotherapy or cancer or something, who's going to have a significant drop-off in her fertility, would benefit from either egg or embryo freezing because very often their treatment will make them a lot less fertile. So we're looking for some parameters. One thing that we can do is do an ultrasound and measure what are called antral follicles. And those are little tiny follicles on the ovaries. When we see more than 6 in each ovary, we would say that that's a good ovarian reserve. And that usually correlates with an AMH level that's over 1.
What's AMH?
An anti-Mullerian hormone, which is a hormone we're now using to determine ovarian reserve. But there are some exceptions. For example, women with polycystic ovary syndrome, women who have irregular cycles, and they will have many follicles, and their AMH will be high. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the quality of the eggs will be as good as would be suggested by the number of antral follicles or the AMH. So we have to look at all the parameters and the patient herself to determine, how good a candidate she is for that.
Okay. And just one more question before we move on to Emily and hear a little bit about your story. I was wondering if there are any risks. I know some people have asked me when I've talked about egg freezing, wait, doesn't that cause cancer because you're injecting all these hormones? So are there any risks involved?
There are risks, but they're rare. So you have to balance always, I guess, every time we drive, we balance, going out and getting out of our garage to go somewhere, or even staying at home for some people. So there are always risks, but it's a very safe procedure, and it has to be a safe procedure because it's an elective procedure. But the risks of the medications, in terms of ovarian cancer, there is really no evidence that that's the case. What people worried about earlier was that there was an increased reported risk of ovarian cancer in some women using these hormones and doing IVF, but probably it was just because we were paying attention to those women were being seen in a medical setting to begin with, so they were identified. The other is that there may be some reason why a woman who is going to be at risk for ovarian cancer is also less fertile.
Sure, that makes sense.
And a woman who doesn't have children is also going to be at higher risk for ovarian cancer. So there are some confounding variables. At this point, we think that a few cycles of IVF are not going to increase the risk of ovarian cancer. And if somebody has concern about that, then they can use birth control pills for an extended period and mitigate the risk of having ovulated many ovulations. If you then ovulate less, then you can sort of balance it out. There's a risk to the actual procedure, especially if you have a lot of follicles. The more eggs a woman has, the greater the risk of hemorrhage, because you have to, each time you put the needle into the ovary, you risk a hemorrhage from that particular needle stick. So there's a balance in terms of how many follicles we try to get in terms of minimizing the risk of hemorrhage and, in some cases, hyperstimulation syndrome, which can occur when the ovaries are very large, against the benefit of storing the eggs.
What is the optimal number of eggs you would want someone to get in this process?
Well, it depends a little on her age.
Okay.
So that a very young woman doesn't need very many and makes a lot.
There's the rub.
Yeah, there's the rub, right. So, in a donor, we always have recipient couples who are upset if the donor doesn't give them, 30 eggs. So, you're only going to need 2 or 3,
Right?
Because they're highly fertile, right? So, so in somebody who's 35 or under, I would say, we're in good shape if we have 15 eggs or less.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem is when you get older than that, you need more and you make less.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the problem. It's the double whammy of aging.
So if you're going to freeze your eggs, do it as young as you can. There's my flag. Don't wait till you're 37, if possible. So Emily, you are freshly out of this experience of freezing your eggs. Can you tell us a little bit about it, starting with what prompted you to take this course of action?
Sure. So I was actually planning on starting a family this year, 36 years old, and some events occurred in my life that resulted in my marriage unraveling and ending very abruptly and unexpectedly. And when I called to tell my mother that I was getting a divorce, she said to me, "If you are into it, I will pay to have you freeze your eggs." And
Hey, Mom.
Yeah.
Totally. My parents helped me too.
So I was like, that sounds like a pretty good idea. So I did, had the benefit of being friends with Maymay, and she, walked me through it, and she referred me to her doctor, and so it was just a great benefit to me to have women in my life that were ahead of me in this process, and I really took their experiences to heart.
Would you tell us a little bit about any fears or judgments you may have had going into this process?
Sure. I didn't really feel judgment from other people, but for myself, for the past 7 years, I've been on a very dedicated spiritual path. And a big part of that is not approaching my life from a place of fear, from approaching my life from a place of knowing and trusting that everything is working out just as it should. And so part of me was feeling like this was a little bit of a fear-based decision, and that in some way I was doubting my ability to create a life that is going to work out for me in the best way it should. But the more that I thought about it and just breathed through it, I came to the realization that if I didn't do it, I'd probably be carrying around more fear anyways, as much as I was trying not to. And what an incredible time to be alive, where we have this opportunity. And I really feel that my experience in doing this is just allowing me to be so present in my life and not thinking to the future, not feeling like I need to connect with somebody maybe prematurely, or connecting with somebody more deeply that I'm not totally in alignment with because I want to have a child. So I just feel an incredible sense of freedom and relief, and my experience went very well. I actually was able to create 30 eggs, and I only had to do injections for 7 days. And the whole experience, aside from the injections, that was a little bit, that took a few days to get used to, because you're giving 2 to 3 injections a day. But by the end, I felt like I was a nurse, and I felt very empowered. And one of the fears I had was that the injections would make me really sad or moody or emotional. But I found that the injections were more just a mood exacerbator than something that brings you down. So I had some days where I was so happy, I could not believe it. People were like, "What are you on?" Fertility drugs. So overall, it was a very positive experience, and really only took about 2 to 3 weeks out of my life.
Well, that's awesome. I'm glad you had such a positive experience. Didn't you also have a friend who said that she gained 18 pounds or something? That sounded like it could be a little fear creating.
Yes, actually, one of my girlfriends who is very slim, she did this 10 years ago. And she was like, "Get ready to buy some new dresses because I gained 18 pounds and it stayed on me for 6 months." I was like, "Wow, okay. This is gonna be a good thing for me. I'm gonna just, make peace with my vanity." But I didn't gain any weight. And I think I talked to the nurse about it. She said 10 years ago they thought that they had to give much higher doses for it to work. And so now they realize that's not the case. And so most people, maybe gain 5 pounds, and it's pretty much fluid. Right? Fluid related.
Good. So what would you say to someone now when you have girlfriends who come to you to talk to you about egg freezing?
I would say that if you can afford it, there is absolutely no reason. And you're not ready, or you don't have somebody in your life presently, and being a mother is definitely something you want to do. I would say there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't do it. Because I was thinking back, how the birth control pill must have really changed things for those women in that generation. And this is, the next biggest game changer for us. I mean, I'm watching my sister has 2 little kids, and it is a full-time job. And so whatever your reasons are for wanting to wait, if you're creating something, you feel like you have an important purpose on this planet, and you're not quite ready to fully turn over to being a mother yet, this is really a huge opportunity for women to have more time. And I was living so much longer. I really think we're going to be living well into our hundreds. So the whole idea of being an older mom, I think in the next 20, 30 years, it's going to be very normal.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing that. I wanted to open it up now to the audience for you guys to ask questions. I'm sure some of you must be curious, possibly contemplating going through this. Questions for Dr. Rodi or Emily?
But I've been friends with Mamie and obviously walked through her journey. And it's funny, I'm here for my girlfriends who aren't here because I feel like I'm sitting here going, God, I wish I could turn back the clock to actually freeze my eggs because I just feel like exactly like I loved what you said about it gives you this sense of freedom, and you don't have to go out with that guy who asked you just because he asked you, because maybe he could be my baby daddy, Right. But so I just feel like I guess my question is there an age where you actually say, honey, think that ship has sailed?
Great question.
Some of it depends on the individual. So there are general numbers, but when you're actually talking to an individual, the first thing to know is that there is a wide range of how fertile a woman is at any particular time. So at 25, almost everybody's fertile. At 47, almost nobody's fertile. and at 38 is about the 50-50 mark, which is why sometimes somebody will say, I don't know why they're scaremongering. You know, I know all these women who are 39 having all these babies. Well, there's 50% that I guess you don't know, because that's how it breaks down. So some of it is to say, okay, if you're 45, 46, 47, chances are that even if we get a lot of eggs and we fertilize some of them, and we actually look at them once they're embryos, the majority of those by far will not be normal. So even if you can make eggs. So then the issue is, you know, how likely is it that those eggs are actually going to do what you need them to do? So at 35, the majority of women are still fertile enough so that those eggs will actually result in a baby. But as you get older and older, it's less and less so. So it's really worth looking at the individual, and also to discuss the relative issues of cost. If money is no barrier, and the woman just wants to, she got to 41 and this is the first time she thought about it, and she wants to do it, then do it. But do it with the knowledge that it's not the same kind of insurance policy that it is at 30.
And speaking to that point about not having to grab whatever guy asks you out on a date as your potential baby daddy, I wanted to speak to that because I was 37 and a half when I froze my eggs. I was single. I'd been divorced also, and just wound up in this position that I never thought I'd be in a million years of being over 35 and single, and really knowing my whole life that I wanted to have a family. And for me, going through the egg freezing process was an immense relief and an immense sense of freedom. And I mean, regardless of whether I ever used those eggs or not, I knew the minute it was done that it was worth it, because I was not a frantic, freaky 35-plus-year-old woman running around being, oh my God, I've got to find a husband. I was just like, I just immediately felt like my whole spirit open up and relax. And I just started breathing into my experience and being like, here I am, and I'm going to embrace the amazing life that I have, and I'm going to celebrate myself. And 6 months later, I was in a relationship, got into a relationship with the love of my life, and 6 months after that, I was married. And so it was like, for me, I felt like it was almost a permission I needed to give myself to let go and trust and surrender. And then, bam, there he showed up 6 months later. So it was pretty amazing for me.
I'm encouraging my girlfriend who just got into a relationship. She's 37, and he wants kids, but she, they're not going to jump in and have kids in 2 minutes. So I feel like, honestly, I almost feel like there should be a campaign that talks about egg freezing, because I would have been the first to sign up, and I just feel like so many women are waiting so much longer, like me, like us, and so I guess it's really just like
So she actually has the additional option of freezing embryos with this person. I mean, she'll need, a legal agreement with him if they're not married, so that, they know what is going to happen if they actually don't parent together. But the benefit of the embryos is that you can then, so you start out with 15 eggs. Not all of them are going to fertilize. And if you grow them out to day 5, you'll get an idea of how many actually made it that far. And if you really want to know, you can biopsy them and check for chromosomal abnormalities. And then you really have an idea of what you have in the freezer.
Yeah.
So if you have a partner, then you have a lot more information.
Is it still true, Dr. Rodi, too, that frozen embryos are more stable than frozen eggs?
I think that that is mainly an issue of you're freezing something that already has more potential.
Okay.
Okay, so if you freeze a blastocyst that made it through all these hurdles, then the likelihood that that one is going to make it is greater than one egg, because it took more than one egg to get to that point. You know,
Gotcha.
in a 25-year-old, it may only take 4 or 5 eggs. In a 40-year-old, it may take 10.
So in that type of situation, would you suggest that she did like froze her eggs individually just in case as the backup plan, and then froze the embryos? So
Right.
like you do 50-50.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's probably
And
a
if
good
she
solution.
makes a lot of them, a lot of eggs, then she can use the same batch to do both. If she doesn't make that many, I would say, you know, decide one way or the other. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other questions? Great.
Yeah. So, what do you suggest asking a clinic when you're trying to decide? Because it's $15,000 to $25,000 depending on how many cycles you have to do, and it's a lot of money, and it's all your hope in the future. Like, and there's so many clinics. I'm sure there'll be tons, sponsoring and advertising here. What do you look at and ask them?
Let's have Dr. Rodi answer that question. What would you ask?
Well, I think that one of the things, because not that many clinics have a lot of experience with actually thawing, I think the first question is to ask, what your chances are. What about your profile can give you some answers as to how successful this procedure will be for you. If you're in LA, there just aren't that many bad programs. Okay, so the number one determination of how well you're going to do is you. And I would start with that. So, talk to, a doctor, choose somebody who you had a good experience with, or choose just somebody who's close, because you're going to be going in a lot. Choose somebody who other patients have had good experiences with, and let that individual and maybe a second opinion give you an idea of how likely this is will be a successful procedure for you.
And I would just add to that too, I ended up only having to do one cycle, and my total cost was, I think, around $8,000. So it wasn't, I was under the impression it was more expensive as well.
And a final note to add to the expenses is, I had a friend recently ask me and say, I don't have a lot of money, like what's the cheapest way to do this? And I said, the cheapest way is get pregnant naturally. Sorry. Nothing can beat that. It's free. Okay. But, the thing about doing egg freezing is once you've done the egg freezing, you're basically halfway through IVF. So when you go through IVF, because I've done both now, the first half of IVF is exactly the same as egg freezing. It's just that, then you freeze the eggs when you're egg freezing, whereas when you do IVF, then you fertilize the eggs and you freeze the embryos, or you transfer the embryos fresh. So it's not like that money is a totally sunk cost. Like if you do end up using the eggs or doing IVF later, you won't have to re-spend that initial money. That money's spent and you now leapfrog to the next stage. So.
And I think
Something
too,
to
just
consider, too.
Coming at it from a more proactive place, before you've tried to get pregnant for many years and then you're going to IVF, I think it's a lot easier emotionally. So for me, my experience was positive. It was easy. It wasn't that big of a deal. Whereas, if I kind of just ignored it, and then I'm in my early 40s and now I'm wanting to have a baby and going through that, I think that's going to be a lot more taxing emotionally.
Are there questions to ask a clinic who's really good at IVF, whether they're good at fertility preservation, which is the late 30s women, rather than a 25-year-old cancer patient?
There's not enough information for anybody. If somebody tells you they have a lot of information, they probably don't. I mean, what they do is they have statistics for their IVF, they have statistics for embryo freezing, but it's if something's only been generally available for a year, and everybody else was on an investigational protocol before that, there is just not that much information that's going to address your situation in particular. I mean, you can look for a good lab, but sometimes a good lab has reasons why it's good for reasons that don't apply to you, which is they cherry pick. So, you know, if you have an FSH that's a little high, or your AMH is a little low, or your, you know, all the jargon, if you're not going to boost their numbers, for some reason it's not offered to you. Yep. So you want really a program that's going to take all comers and is going to address your issues. So, you know, how likely is it you're going to get 12 eggs from one cycle? Mm-hmm. And we have ways of determining that ahead of time. Mm-hmm. You know, yes.
Well, I have another. Well, just on that, on what you asked about, you know, what to ask. I had the same thing because I had 3 miscarriages, mm-hmm. and I was at my OB, and I was like, wow. Somebody finally said, "What are you doing at your OB? You're, you know, 30, no, I was 40, hello, 40 years old, and you're at your OB." What? So I went to a fertility doctor, and it was interesting because I'm like an avid researcher, crazy time, and I went to like the top specialist that people suggested, and then some woman told me to go to this place that was totally out of my zip code, and if anyone knows me, I don't drive that east. But it was interesting because when I sat down with the first fertility doctor, you know, he's like, "Okay, oh, you're 40. Well, you know your number," and they give you the whole spiel, which is like, "Oh, it's not looking good," but he was very technical, and I just said, okay, and he wanted me to go straight to IVF. But I have been pregnant so many times, I thought, and before that. And I said, well, wait a second, what are my other options? And he really kind of kept shipping me to the IVF department. Right. And so I said, okay, you know, like inherently in my like moral, like inner compass, I just was like, you're not my people. And then I went to another doctor who was so gnarly and like really drew a picture saying, you do know the likelihood is so minuscule, la la la. I was like, I totally do, and he wanted to ship me to IVF too, and I said, okay, look, this is what my dream is, and I want to know if you're on board. My dream is that we try to get pregnant naturally and have you monitor me and see what might be wrong. And because I have juicy eggs. I was an egg donor in college. The doctor said I had juicy eggs, so I know it. So I just kept, like all my years, I kept knowing I had juicy eggs, even though who knows what that means. But in my head, they meant they were awesome. And so I kept saying, like, I have to trust my instinct that, like, I know all the science. I get the science. And I'm not saying the science is, you know, going to be wrong. But I also had to trust my inner, like, compass. And it ended up that I had fibroids, and that was the cause, potentially the cause of my miscarriages or not. But I just had a feeling, and I trusted my feeling. And then right after the fibroid, he said, well, you don't have a problem getting pregnant. We know that. But we don't have time, because at that point I was 41. Right. And I said, okay, well, what are our options? And he was very open. He wasn't like, I think we definitely should go to IVF. Now he said, okay, I'll meet you halfway. Let's do IUI. He goes, at least the swimmers are, you know, taking the tram up. And so I said, perfect, done. But it was like that compromise where I think that like a lot of clinics, from what my friends and experiences, is just that they're very so hard-edged, and like what you said is like, there's so many reasons why is it good for you. And I think that part of like exactly what you said is what I love to hear, is that, you know, there is no fast answer to any of our like destinies, but there is like a little bit of mix of science with your intuition. Your women's intuition, I think, has a lot to do with some of this. And so for me, it was like, you know, we did IUI first time, and hello, I have a baby. but it is, yes.
Intrauterine insemination. So that's just sending the
turkey baster.
There you go. Right.
Other questions over here?
Thank you. So after you freeze or preserve an egg and then you want to get pregnant, I'm curious, is it always go to IVF? And then what are the other variables? You know, say you're 41 or 42, and there's some endocrine changes at that age too, besides just the egg quality. So could you speak a little bit on that?
Sure. You know, before we separated women's eggs from their uterus, we didn't know why it was that we aged. We didn't know, is this an egg problem? Is this a uterine problem? But now we know that the ovaries actually, the eggs actually age about 15 years ahead of most uteruses actually will be able to carry a pregnancy 15 years longer than the ovaries are able to make eggs that will make babies. Right. And we know that because early on we took eggs from young women and put them into older women, and eggs from older women and put them into young women, and the predictor was how old the mother of the eggs was. And that allowed us to do this whole area of egg donation, where women who are in their late 30s and 40s and even 50s use an embryo that was created from a younger egg donor. So that if you the nice thing about freezing your eggs or your embryos when you're younger is that you can then put them into your uterus when you're older. Because your uterus, even if you're in menopause, we can give you the hormones to prepare the uterus for a pregnancy. And very often when I see a couple or a single woman who is in her late 30s, one of my early questions in that first meeting is, how many children do you envision having? Because everybody has their own ideas about how big their families are going to be. And many people will say, you know, if we can just get one, we're going to be happy. Or other people will say, you know, I know it's really greedy, but we'd like 2 or we'd like 3. And for those couples, I say, consider freezing embryos for the second and third. Because once you have the first one, if you would like a second one, the pain is almost as great that you can't have a second one as not having the first one.
Yep.
And we have a number of patients who froze their embryos in their late 30s and early 40s, who then went on to have a baby through IUI or just naturally for the first one, and came back to use the embryos for their second or third. That is also very common for patients who have cancer and are treated with cancer drugs. They will sometimes come back, if they're young enough, and be able to have their first child naturally. So I had a patient, for example, who had colon cancer. She had her surgery, had her chemotherapy. Well, she had her surgery, harvested the eggs, froze the embryos because she was married, went on to have her chemotherapy. A year after her chemotherapy, came back, and she was able to get pregnant on her own for her first baby. So she was pregnant, breastfed, and when she stopped breastfeeding, she was starting in menopause. And so we gave her the hormones and put in her embryos, and she had her second child.
That's awesome. So we're going to have to wrap up here. We're coming to the end of our session. And I just wanted to say thank you again to Emily Pereira. And can you tell us where to find you online, Emily?
Yes, you can find me at bethebeginner.com. I also have another site called Tales of Ordinary Magic. So
great, and thank you for being here. And Dr. Ingrid Rodi, and can you tell us where to find
pleasure.
you?
I have a Facebook page, Ingrid Rodi MD, and a website, rodimd.com.
Brilliant. And I'd like to remind everyone that you're welcome to come up and ask questions after this session. If you have more, you can also sign up through Fertility Planet to have one-on-one meetings with any of the panelists or the speakers, so please take advantage of that. And all of the videos, you know, all the sessions will be recorded, so you'll be able to watch the videos later. And please be sure to share your social media with the hashtag FPLA14. And thanks for attending our session. Have a great conference.